Hey you, do you like the Tales from the Crypt series? Do you like spooky things in general? Then check out the Good Evening Kitties podcast. That's Good Evening Kitties podcast. GOODEVENING KIDDIES podcast. Each week, I'll review a new episode from the TV series The Tales from the Crypt. Find me on Podbay, Podbean, or iTunes. That's the Good Evening Kitties podcast. Check it out today.
Tim isn't a perfect man. He's not the perfect husband or father. He's a guy struggling to provide for his family. No matter how hard he tries, it's all falling apart. When it looks like things can't get any worse, the accident happens. Tim can't remember a thing. Only the sound of twisting metal, of the nightmares, and for the coyote stalking him through the halls of still waters. The doctors are lying, hiding behind false and stolen faces. Tim and the other patients are prisoners. Or is it all in his head? If he could only just remember. Follow Tim on his downward spiral through the asylum, through hell and back, as he uncovers the truth of what happened to his family. Tim E. Less is a disturbed horror thriller of insanity, chemical seduction, and true nightmares come to life. Silent Hill meets The Cell. Sometimes the real horror is remembering. Tim E. Less by Lucas Milian. Available on Amazon Kindle and Amazon Paperback.
People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos is brought to you by BunnySlippers.com and FoundItemClothing.com. You're not new to the show. You know who they are and what they do. Slippers, novelty shirts from your favorite cult films. Yeah. Okay. This is a reading episode. Next episode should be a full episode, unless there's another reading episode. So, thank you for listening to PGTTCM. Go to us at pgttcm.com, pgttcm.podbean.com, where you can find our Patreon button to help, support the show. You can also go to paypal.me/pgttcm. And, why not go to audibletrials.com/pgttcm? Sign up for Audible, get a free book, we get something, you get something. It's all good. And enough for ads. And how about edited and produced by D.B. Spitzer? People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos is part of the Dark Myths Collective, and you can find out more about Dark Myths and all their many, many podcasts by going to darkmyths.org. I'd like to recommend Blurry Photos with David Flora. You can find them at blurryphotos.org. And it is a podcast about the unexplained and the unexplored. They've got a vast library to listen to, and it's a lot of fun. All right, on with the show.
People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos starts now.
Recorded by Peter Yearsley. Ghost Stories of an Antiquary, Volume 1, by M.R. James. Author's Preface. If anyone is curious about my local settings, let it be recorded that St. Bertrand de Comminges and Viborg are real places, that in O Whistle and I'll Come to You, I had Felixstowe in mind. As for the fragments of ostensible erudition which are scattered about my pages, hardly anything in them is not pure invention. There never was, naturally, any such book as that which I quote in The Treasure of Abbot Thomas. Canon Alberic's scrapbook was written in 1894 and printed soon after in the National Review. Lost Hearts appeared in the Pall Mall magazine. Of the next 5 stories, most of which were read to friends at Christmas time at King's College, Cambridge, I only recollect that I wrote number 13 in 1899, while The Treasure of Abbot Thomas was composed in the summer of 1904. M.R. James. Canon Alberic's Scrapbook. Saint Bertrand de Comminges is a decayed town on the spurs of the Pyrenees, not very far from Toulouse, and still nearer to Bagnères de Luchon. It was the site of a bishopric until the Revolution, and has a cathedral which is visited by a certain number of tourists. In the spring of 1883, an Englishman arrived at this old-world place. I can hardly dignify it with the name of city, for there are not 1,000 inhabitants. He was a Cambridge man, who had come specially from Toulouse to see St. Bertrand's church, and had left 2 friends, who were less keen archaeologists than himself, in their hotel at Toulouse, under promise to join him on the following morning. Half an hour at the church would satisfy them, and all 3 could then pursue their journey in the direction of Auch. But our Englishman had come early on the day in question, and proposed to himself to fill a notebook, and to use several dozens of plates in the process of describing and photographing every corner of the wonderful church that dominates the little hill of Comminges. In order to carry out this design satisfactorily, it was necessary to monopolize the verger of the church for the day. The verger, or sacristan, I prefer the latter appellation, inaccurate as it may be, was accordingly sent for by the somewhat brusque lady who keeps the inn of the Chapeau Rouge, and when he came, the Englishman found him an unexpectedly interesting object of study. It was not in the personal appearance of the little, dry, wizened old man that the interest lay, for he was precisely like dozens of other church guardians in France, but in a curious, furtive, or rather hunted and oppressed air which he had. He was perpetually half glancing behind him. The muscles of his back and shoulders seemed to be hunched in a continual nervous contraction, as if he were expecting every moment to find himself in the clutch of an enemy. The Englishman hardly knew whether to put him down as a man haunted by a fixed delusion, or as one oppressed by a guilty conscience, or as an unbearably hen-pecked husband. The probabilities, when reckoned up, certainly pointed to the last idea, but still the impression conveyed was that of a more formidable persecutor even than a termagant wife. However, the Englishman, let us call him Denniston, was soon too deep in his notebook, and too busy with his camera, to give more than an occasional glance to the sacristan. Whenever he did look at him, he found him at no great distance, either huddling himself back against the wall or crouching in one of the gorgeous stalls. Denniston became rather fidgety after a time, mingled suspicions that he was keeping the old man from his déjeuner, that he was regarded as likely to make away with St. Bertrand's ivory crozier, or with the dusty, stuffed crocodile that hangs over the font, began to torment him. "Won't you go home?" he said at last. "I'm quite well able to finish my notes alone. You can lock me in if you like. I shall want at least 2 hours more here, and it must be cold for you, isn't it?" "Good heavens!" said the little man, whom the suggestion seemed to throw into a state of unaccountable terror. "Such a thing cannot be thought of for a moment. Leave monsieur alone in the church? No, no. 2 hours, 3 hours, all will be the same to me. I have breakfasted. I am not at all cold, with many thanks to monsieur." "Very well, my little man," quoth Denniston to himself. "You've been warned, and you must take the consequences." Before the expiration of the 2 hours, the stalls, the enormous dilapidated organ, the choir screen of Bishop Jean de Mauleon, the remnants of glass and tapestry, and the objects in the treasure chamber had been well and truly examined, the sacristan still keeping at Denniston's heels, and every now and then whipping round as if he had been stung, when one or other of the strange noises that trouble a large empty building fell on his ear. Curious noises they were sometimes. "Once," Denniston said to me, "I could have sworn I heard a thin metallic voice laughing high up in the tower." I darted an inquiring glance at my sacristan. He was white to the lips. "It is he. That is, it is no one. The door is locked," was all that he said, and we looked at each other for a full minute. Another little incident puzzled Denniston a good deal. He was examining a large dark picture that hangs behind the altar, one of a series illustrating the miracles of Saint Bertrand. The composition of the picture is well nigh indecipherable, but there is a Latin legend below which runs thus: Qualitur es Bertrandus liberavit hominem quem diabolos Dio volebat strangulare. How Saint Bertrand delivered a man whom the devil long sought to strangle. Denniston was turning to the sacristan with a smile and a jocular remark of some sort on his lips, but he was confounded to see the old man on his knees, gazing at the picture with the eye of a suppliant in agony, his hands tightly clasped, and a rain of tears on his cheeks. Denniston naturally pretended to have noticed nothing, but the question would not go away from him. Why should a daub of this kind affect anyone so strongly? He seemed to himself to be getting some sort of clue to the reason of the strange look that had been puzzling him all day. The man must be a monomaniac. But what was his monomania? It was nearly 5 o'clock. The short day was drawing in, and the church began to fill with shadows, while the curious noises, the muffled footfalls and distant talking voices that had been perceptible all day, seemed, no doubt because of the fading light and the consequently quickened sense of hearing, to become more frequent and insistent. The sacristan began for the first time to show signs of hurry and impatience. He heaved a sigh of relief when camera and notebook were finally packed up and stowed away, and hurriedly beckoned Denniston to the western door of the church under the tower. It was time to ring the Angelus. A few pulls at the reluctant rope, and the great bell Bertrande, high in the tower, began to speak, and swung her voice up among the pines and down to the valleys loud with mountain streams, calling the dwellers on those lonely hills to remember and repeat the salutation of the angel to her whom he called blessed among women. With that, a profound quiet seemed to fall for the first time that day upon the little town, and Denniston and the sacristan went out of the church. On the doorstep they fell into conversation. Monsieur seemed to interest himself in the old choir books in the sacristy. Undoubtedly. I was going to ask you if there were a library in the town. No, monsieur. Perhaps there used to be one belonging to the chapter, but it is now such a small place. Here came a strange pause of irresolution, as it seemed. Then, with a sort of plunge, he went on, "But if monsieur is amateur de vieux livres, I have at home something that might interest him. It is not 100 yards." At once, all Denniston's cherished dreams of finding priceless manuscripts in untrodden corners of France flashed up, to die down again the next moment. It was probably a stupid missal of Plantin's printing, about 1580. Where was the likelihood that a place so near Toulouse would not have been ransacked long ago by collectors? However, it would be foolish not to go. He would reproach himself forever after if he refused. So they set off. On the way, the curious irresolution and sudden determination of the sacristan recurred to Denniston, and he wondered in a shamefaced way whether he was being decoyed into some purlieu to be made away with as a supposed rich Englishman. He contrived, therefore, to begin talking with his guide, and to drag in a rather clumsy fashion, the fact that he expected 2 friends to join him early the next morning. To his surprise, the announcement seemed to relieve the sacristan at once of some of the anxiety that oppressed him. "That is well," he said quite brightly. "That is very well. Monsieur will travel in company with his friends. They will always be near him. It is a good thing to travel thus in company, sometimes." The last word appeared to be added as an afterthought, and to bring with it a relapse into gloom for the poor little man. They were soon at the house, which was one rather larger than its neighbours, stone-built, with a shield carved over the door, the shield of Alberic de Murlian, a collateral descendant, Denniston tells me, of Bishop Jean de Murlian. This Alberic was a canon of Comminges from 1680 to 1701. The upper windows of the mansion were boarded up, and the whole place bore, as does the rest of Comminges, the aspect of decaying age. Arrived on his doorstep, the sacristan paused a moment. "Perhaps," he said, "perhaps after all Monsieur has not the time." "Not at all. Lots of time. Nothing to do till tomorrow. Let us see what it is you have got." The door was opened at this point, and a face looked out, a face far younger than the sacristan's, but bearing something of the same distressing look. Only here it seemed to be the mark not so much of fear for personal safety as of acute anxiety on behalf of another. Plainly the owner of the face was the sacristan's daughter, and, but for the expression I have described, she was a handsome girl enough. She brightened up considerably on seeing her father accompanied by an able-bodied stranger. A few remarks passed between father and daughter, of which Denniston only caught the words said by the sacristan, "He was laughing in the church," words which were answered only by a look of terror from the girl. But in another minute they were in the sitting-room of the house, a small, high chamber with a stone floor, full of moving shadows cast by a wood fire that flickered on a great hearth. Something of the character of an oratory was imparted to it by a tall crucifix, which reached almost to the ceiling on one side. The figure was painted of the natural colours. The cross was black. Under this stood a chest of some age and solidity, and when a lamp had been brought and chairs set, the sacristan went to this chest and produced therefrom, with growing excitement and nervousness, as Denniston thought, a large book, wrapped in a white cloth, on which cloth a cross was rudely emblazoned in red thread. Even before the wrapping had been removed, Denniston began to be interested by the size and shape of the volume. Too large for a missal, he thought, and not the shape of an antiphona. Perhaps it may be something good after all. The next moment the book was open, and Denniston felt that he had at last lit upon something better than good. Before him lay a large folio, bound, perhaps, late in the 17th century, with the arms of Canon Alberic de Murlian stamped in gold on the sides. There may have been 150 leaves of paper in the book, and on almost every one of them was fastened a leaf from an illuminated manuscript. Such a collection Denniston had hardly dreamed of in his wildest moments. Here were 10 leaves from a copy of Genesis, illustrated with pictures which could not be later than AD 700. Further on was a complete set of pictures from a Psalter of English execution of the very finest kind that the 13th century could produce. And, perhaps best of all, there were 20 leaves of unsealed writing in Latin, which, as a few words seen here and there told him at once, must belong to some very early unknown patristic treatise. Could it possibly be a fragment of the copy of Papias on the words of our Lord, which was known to have existed as late as the 12th century at Nîmes? Footnote. We now know that these leaves did contain a considerable fragment of that work, if not of that actual copy of it. Return to the text. In any case, his mind was made up. That book must return to Cambridge with him, even if he had to draw the whole of his balance from the bank and stay at Saint-Bertrand till the money came. He glanced up at the sacristan to see if his face yielded any hint that the book was for sale. The sacristan was pale, and his lips were working. "If monsieur will turn on to the end," he said. So monsieur turned on, meeting new treasures at every rise of a leaf, and at the end of the book he came upon 2 sheets of paper, of much more recent date than anything he had seen yet, which puzzled him considerably. They must be contemporary, he decided, with the unprincipled Canon Alberic, who had doubtless plundered the chapter library of Saint Bertrand to form this priceless scrapbook. On the first of the paper sheets was a plan carefully drawn and instantly recognizable by a person who knew the ground, of the south aisle and cloisters of Saint Bertrand. There were curious signs looking like planetary symbols, and a few Hebrew words in the corners. And in the north-west angle of the cloister was a cross drawn in gold paint. Below the plan were some lines of writing in Latin, which ran thus: Responsa duodecimus dec 1694 interrogatum est inveniamne? Responsum est invenies. Fiamne dives? Fies. Vivamne invidendus? Vives. Moriarne in lecto meo? Ita. Answers of the 12th of December, 1694. It was asked, Shall I find it? Answer, Thou shalt. Shall I become rich? Thou wilt. Shall I live an object of envy? Thou wilt. Shall I die in my bed? Thou wilt. A good specimen of the treasure hunter's record. Quite reminds one of Mr. Minor Canon Quatremain in Old St. Paul's, was Denniston's comment, and he turns the leaf. What he then saw impressed him, as he has often told me, more than he could have conceived any drawing or picture capable of impressing him. And though the drawing he saw is no longer in existence, there is a photograph of it, which I possess, which fully bears out that statement. The picture in question was a sepia drawing at the end of the 17th century, representing, one would say at first sight, a biblical scene. For the architecture, the picture represented an interior, and the figures had that semi-classical flavour about them which the artists of 200 years ago thought appropriate to illustrations of the Bible. On the right was a king on his throne, the throne elevated on 12 steps, a canopy overhead, soldiers on either side, evidently King Solomon. He was bending forward with outstretched sceptre, in attitude of command. His face expressed horror and disgust, yet there was in it also the mark of imperious command and confident power. The left half of the picture was the strangest, however, the interest plainly centred there. On the pavement before the throne were grouped 4 soldiers surrounding a crouching figure, which must be described in a moment. A 5th soldier lay dead on the pavement, his neck distorted and his eyeballs starting from his head. The 4 surrounding guards were looking at the king. In their faces the sentiment of horror was intensified. They seemed, in fact, only restrained from flight by their implicit trust in their master. All this terror was plainly excited by the being that crouched in their midst. I entirely despair of conveying by any words the impression which this figure makes upon anyone who looks at it. I recollect once showing the photograph of the drawing to a lecturer on morphology, a person of, I was going to say, abnormally sane and unimaginative habits of mind. He absolutely refused to be alone for the rest of that evening, and he told me afterwards that for many nights he had not dared to put out his light before going to sleep. However, the main traits of the figure I can at least indicate. At first you saw only a mass of coarse, matted black hair. Presently it was seen that this covered a body of fearful thinness, almost a skeleton, but with the muscles standing out like wires. The hands were of a dusky pallor, covered like the body with long coarse hairs and hideously taloned. The eyes, touched in with a burning yellow, had intensely black pupils, and were fixed upon the throned king with a look of beast-like hate. Imagine one of the awful bird-catching spiders of South America translated into human form, and endowed with intelligence just less than human, and you will have some faint conception of the terror inspired by the appalling effigy. One remark is universally made by those to whom I have shown the picture. It was drawn from the life. As soon as the first shock of his irresistible fright had subsided, Denniston stole a look at his hosts. The sacristan's hands were pressed upon his eyes. His daughter, looking up at the cross on the wall, was telling her beads feverishly. At last the question was asked, "Is this book for sale?" There was the same hesitation, the same plunge of determination that he had noticed before, and then came the welcome answer, "If monsieur pleases." "How much do you ask for it?" I will take 250 francs. This was confounding. Even a collector's conscience is sometimes stirred, and Denniston's conscience was tenderer than a collector's. "My good man," he said again and again, "your book is worth far more than 250 francs. I assure you, far more." But the answer did not vary. "I will take 250 francs, not more." There was really no possibility of refusing such a chance. The money was paid, the receipt signed, a glass of wine drunk over the transaction, and then the sacristan seemed to become a new man. He stood upright, he ceased to throw those suspicious glances behind him, he actually laughed or tried to laugh. Denniston rose to go. "I shall have the honour of accompanying monsieur to his hotel?" said the sacristan. "Oh, no, thanks. It isn't 100 yards. I know the way perfectly, and there is a moon." The offer was pressed 3 or 4 times, and refused as often. "Then monsieur will summon me if he finds occasion. He will keep the middle of the road. The sides are so rough." "Certainly, certainly," said Denniston, who was impatient to examine his prize by himself, and he stepped out into the passage with his book under his arm. Here he was met by the daughter. She, it appeared, was anxious to do a little business on her own account, perhaps, like Gehazi, to take somewhat from the foreigner whom her father had spared. "A silver crucifix and chain for the neck? Monsieur would perhaps be good enough to accept it?" Well, really, Denniston hadn't much use for these things. What did Mademoiselle want for it? Nothing. Nothing in the world. Monsieur is more than welcome to it. The tone in which this and much more was said was unmistakably genuine, so that Denniston was reduced to profuse thanks, and submitted to have the chain put round his neck. It really seemed as if he had rendered the father and daughter some service which they hardly knew how to repay. As he set off with his book, they stood at the door looking after him, and they were still looking when he waved them a last good night from the steps of the Chapeau Rouge. Dinner was over, and Denniston was in his bedroom, shut up alone with his acquisition. The landlady had manifested a particular interest in him since he had told her that he had paid a visit to the sacristan and bought an old book from him. He thought, too, that he had heard a hurried dialogue between her and the said sacristan in the passage outside the salle à manger, some words to the effect that Pierre and Bertrand would be sleeping in the house, had closed the conversation. All this time a growing feeling of discomfort had been creeping over him, nervous reaction perhaps after the delight of his discovery. Whatever it was, it resulted in a conviction that there was someone behind him, and that he was far more comfortable with his back to the wall. All of this, of course, weighed light in the balance as against the obvious value of the collection he had acquired. And now, as I said, he was alone in his bedroom, taking stock of Canon Alberic's treasures, in which every moment revealed something more charming. "Bless Canon Alberic," said Denniston, who had an inveterate habit of talking to himself. "I wonder where he is now. Dear me, I wish that landlady would learn to laugh in a more cheering manner. It makes one feel as if there was someone dead in the house. Half a pipe more, did you say? I think perhaps you're right. I wonder what that crucifix is that the young woman insisted on giving me. Last century, I suppose? Yes, probably. It is rather a nuisance of a thing to have round one's neck. Just too heavy. Most likely her father has been wearing it for years. I think I might give it a clean-up before I put it away. He had taken the crucifix off and laid it on the table, when his attention was caught by an object lying on the red cloth just by his left elbow. 2 or 3 ideas of what it might be flitted through his brain with their own incalculable quickness. A pen wiper? No, no such thing in the house. A rat? No, too black. A large spider? I trust to goodness not. No. Good God. A hand, like the hand in that picture. In another infinitesimal flash he had taken it in. Pale, dusky skin, covering nothing but bones and tendons of appalling strength. Coarse black hairs, longer than ever grew on a human hand. Nails rising from the ends of the fingers and curling sharply down and forward, grey, horny, and wrinkled. He flew out of his chair with deadly, inconceivable terror clutching at his heart. The shape, whose left hand rested on the table, was rising to a standing posture behind his seat, its right hand crooked above his scalp. There was black and tattered drapery about it. The coarse hair covered it as in the drawing. The lower jaw was thin. What can I call it? Shallow, like a beast's. Teeth showed behind the black lips. There was no nose. The eyes of a fiery yellow, against which the pupils showed black and intense, and the exulting hate and thirst to destroy life which shone there, were the most horrifying features in the whole vision. There was intelligence of a kind in them, intelligence beyond that of a beast, below that of a man. The feelings which this horror stirred in Denniston were the intensest physical fear and the most profound mental loathing. What did he do? What could he do? He has never been quite certain what words he said, but he knows that he spoke, that he grasped blindly at the silver crucifix, that he was conscious of a movement towards him on the part of the demon, and that he screamed with the voice of an animal in hideous pain. Pierre and Bertrand, the 2 sturdy little serving men who rushed in, saw nothing, but felt themselves thrust aside by something that passed out between them, and found Denniston in a swoon. They set up with him that night, and his 2 friends were at Saint Bertrand by 9 o'clock next morning. He himself, though still shaken and nervous, was almost himself by that time, and his story found credence with them, though not until they had seen the drawing and talked with the sacristan. Almost at dawn the little man had come to the inn on some pretence, and had listened with the deepest interest to the story retailed by the landlady. He showed no surprise. "It is he, it is he, I have seen him myself," was his only comment, and to all questionings but one reply was vouchsafed. "2 fois je l'ai vu, 1000 fois je l'ai senti." He would tell them nothing of the provenance of the book, nor any details of his experiences. "I shall soon sleep, and my rest will be sweet. Why should you trouble me?" he said. Footnote. He died that summer. His daughter married, and settled at Saint-Papoul. She never understood the circumstances of her father's obsession. Return to text. We shall never know what he or Canon Alberic de Mauleon suffered. At the back of that fateful drawing were some lines of writing which may be supposed to throw light on the situation. Contradict Salomonis cum demonio nocturno, Albericus de Mauleone delineavit, ve Deus in adiutorium, PS qui habitat, Sancte Petronde demoniorum effugitor, indicede pro me miserimo, primum iudi nocte, 12 miles sescenti nonaginta quatuor, uidibo mox ultimum peccavi et passus sum, plura ad hoc passurus. Dec vigenti novem 1701, i.e. the dispute of Solomon with the demon of the night, drawn by Albrecht de Molion, versicle, O Lord, make haste to help me, Psalm, whoso dwelleth, 91. Saint Bertrand, who puttest devils to flight, pray for me most unhappy. I saw it first on the night of December the 12th, 1694. Soon I shall see it for the last time. I have sinned and suffered, and have more to suffer yet. December the 29th, 1701. The Gallia Christiana gives the date of the canon's death as December the 31st, 1701, in bed of a sudden seizure. Details of this kind are not common in the great work of the Samarthani. I have never quite understood what was Deniston's view of the events I have narrated. He quoted to me once a text from Ecclesiasticus. Some spirits there be that are created for vengeance, and in their fury lay on sore strokes. On another occasion he said, Isaiah was a very sensible man. Doesn't he say something about night monsters living in the ruins of Babylon? These things are rather beyond us at present. Another confidence of his impressed me rather, and I sympathized with it. We had been last year to Comminges to see Canon Alberic's tomb. It is a great marble erection with an effigy of the canon in a large wig and soutane, and an elaborate eulogy of his learning below. I saw Deniston talking for some time with the vicar of Saint Bertrand's, and as we drove away he said to me, I hope it isn't wrong. You know I am a Presbyterian, but I believe there will be saying of Mass and singing of dirges for Albrecht de Molion's rest. Then he added, with a touch of the northern British in his tone, I had no notion they came so dear. The book is in the Wentworth collection at Cambridge. The drawing was photographed and then burned by Deniston on the day when he left Comminges on the occasion of his first visit. End of Canon Alberic's scrapbook. This is a LibriVox recording. All the LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to find out how to volunteer, please contact LibriVox.org. Recorded by Peter Yearsley. Ghost Stories of an Antiquary, Volume 1, by M.R. James. Lost Hearts. It was, as far as I can ascertain, in September of the year 1811 that a post-chaise drew up before the door of Asselby Hall in the heart of Lincolnshire. The little boy who was the only passenger in the chaise, and who jumped out as soon as it had stopped, looked about him with the keenest curiosity during the short interval that elapsed between the ringing of the bell and the opening of the hall door. He saw a tall, square, red-brick house, built in the reign of Anne. A stone-pillared porch had been added in the purer classical style of 1790. The windows of the house were many, tall and narrow, with small panes and thick white woodwork. A pediment pierced with a round window crowned the front. There were wings to the right and left, connected by curious glazed galleries supported by colonnades with the central block. These wings plainly contained the stables and offices of the house. Each was surmounted by an ornamental cupola with a gilded vane. An evening light shone on the building, making the window-panes glow like so many fires. Away from the hall in front stretched a flat park, studded with oaks and fringed with firs, which stood out against the sky. The clock in the church tower, buried in trees on the edge of the park, only its golden weathercock catching the light, was striking 6, and the sound came gently beating down the wind. It was altogether a pleasant impression, though tinged with the sort of melancholy appropriate to an evening in early autumn, that was conveyed to the mind of the boy who was standing in the porch, waiting for the door to open to him. The post-chaise had brought him from Warwickshire, where some 6 months before he had been left an orphan. Now, owing to the generous offer of his elderly cousin, Mr. Abney, he had come to live at Aswarby. The offer was unexpected, because all who knew anything of Mr. Abney looked upon him as a somewhat austere recluse, into whose steady-going household the advent of a small boy would import a new and, it seemed, incongruous element. The truth is that very little was known of Mr. Abney's pursuits or temper. The professor of Greek at Cambridge had been heard to say that no one knew more of the religious beliefs of the later pagans than did the owner of Aswarby. Certainly his library contained all the then available books bearing on the mysteries, the Orphic poems, the worship of Mithras, and the Neo-Platonists. In the marble-paved hall stood a fine group of Mithras slaying a bull, which had been imported from the Levant at great expense by the owner. He had contributed a description of it to the Gentleman's Magazine, and he had written a remarkable series of articles in the Critical Museum on the superstitions of the Romans of the Lower Empire. He was looked upon, in fine, as a man wrapped up in his books, and it was a matter of great surprise among his neighbours that he should ever have heard of his orphan cousin, Stephen Elliott, much more than he should have volunteered to make him an inmate of Aswarby Hall. Whatever may have been expected by his neighbours, it is certain that Mr. Abney, the tall, the thin, the austere, seemed inclined to give his young cousin a kindly reception. The moment the front door was opened, he darted out of his study, rubbing his hands with delight. "How are you, my boy? How are you? How old are you?" said he. "That is, you're not too much tired, I hope, by your journey to eat your supper?" "No, thank you, sir," said Master Elliott. "I am pretty well." "That's a good lad," said Mr. Abney. "And how old are you, my boy?" It seemed a little odd that he should have asked the question twice in the first 2 minutes of their acquaintance. "I'm 12 years old next birthday, sir," said Stephen. "And when is your birthday, my dear boy? 11th of September, eh? That's very well. Nearly a year hence, isn't it? I like to get these things down in my book. Sure it's 12? Certain?" "Yes, quite sure, sir." Well. Take him to Mrs. Bunch's room, Parkes, and let him have his tea, supper, whatever it is." "Yes, sir," answered the staid Mr. Parkes, and conducted Stephen to the lower regions. Mrs. Bunch was the most comfortable and human person whom Stephen had as yet met at Aswarby. She made him completely at home. They were great friends in a quarter of an hour, and great friends they remained. Mrs. Bunch had been born in the neighbourhood some 55 years before the date of Stephen's arrival, and her residence at the Hall was of 20 years' standing. Consequently, if anyone knew the ins and outs of the house and the district, Mrs. Bunch knew them, and she was by no means disinclined to communicate her information. Certainly there were plenty of things about the Hall and the Hall gardens which Stephen, who was of an adventurous and inquiring turn, was anxious to have explained to him. Who built the temple at the end of the Laurel Walk? Who was the old man whose picture hung on the staircase, sitting at a table with a skull under his hand? These and many similar points were cleared up by the resources of Mrs. Bunch's powerful intellect. There were others, however, of which the explanations furnished were less satisfactory. One November evening, Stephen was sitting by the fire in the housekeeper's room, reflecting on his surroundings. "Is Mr. Abney a good man, and will he go to heaven?" he suddenly asked, with the peculiar confidence which children possess in the ability of their elders to settle these questions, the decision of which is believed to be reserved for other tribunals. "Good, bless the child," said Mrs. Bunch. "Master's as kind a soul as ever I see. Didn't I never tell you of the little boy as he took in out of the street, as you may say, this 7 years back? And the little girl, 2 years after I first come here?" "No, do tell me all about them, Mrs. Bunch. Now, this minute." "Well," said Mrs. Bunch, "the little girl I don't seem to recollect so much about. I know master brought her back with him from his walk one day, and give orders to Mrs. Ellis, as was housekeeper then, as she should be took every care with. And the poor child hadn't no one belonging to her. She told me so her own self, and here she lived with us a matter of 3 weeks, it might be, and then, whether she was something of a gipsy in her blood or what not, but one morning she out of her bed afore any of us had opened an eye, and neither track nor yet trace of her have I set eyes on since. Master was wonderful put about, and had all the ponds dragged, but it's my belief she was had away by them gipsies, for there was singing around the house for as much as an hour the nights she went. And Parkes, he declares he heard them a-calling in the woods all that afternoon. Dear, dear, a odd child she was, so silent in her ways and all, but I was wonderful taken up with her. So domesticated she was, surprising." "And what about the little boy?" said Stephen. "Ah, that poor boy," sighed Mrs. Bunch. "He were a foreigner, Jevony he called himself, and he come a-tweaking his hurdy-gurdy round and about the drive one winter day, and master had him in that minute, and asked all about where he came from, and how old he was, and how he made his way, and where was his relatives, and all as kind as heart could wish. But it went the same way with him. They're a unruly lot, them foreign nations, I do suppose, and he was off one fine morning just the same as the girl. Why he went and what he done was our question for as much as a year after, for he never took his hurdy-gurdy, and there it lays on the shelf." The remainder of the evening was spent by Stephen in miscellaneous cross-examination of Mrs. Bunch, and in efforts to extract a tune from the hurdy-gurdy. That night he had a curious dream. At the end of the passage, at the top of the house, in which his bedroom was situated, there was an old disused bathroom. It was kept locked, but the upper half of the door was glazed, and, since the muslin curtains which used to hang there had long been gone, you could look in and see the lead-lined bath affixed to the wall on the right hand, with its head towards the window. On the night of which I am speaking, Stephen Elliott found himself, as he thought, looking through the glazed door. The moon was shining through the window, and he was gazing at a figure which lay in the bath. His description of what he saw reminds me of what I once beheld myself in the famous vaults of St. Michan's Church in Dublin, which possesses the horrid property of preserving corpses from decay for centuries. A figure inexpressibly thin and pathetic, of a dusty leaden colour, enveloped in a shroud-like garment, the thin lips crooked into a faint and dreadful smile, the hands pressed tightly over the region of the heart. As he looked upon it, a distant, almost inaudible moan seemed to issue from its lips, and the arms began to stir. The terror of the sight forced Stephen backwards, and he awoke to the fact that he was indeed standing on the cold boarded floor of the passage, in the full light of the moon. With a courage which I do not think can be common among boys of his age, he went to the door of the bathroom to ascertain if the figure of his dreams were really there. It was not, and he went back to bed. Mrs. Bunch was much impressed next morning by his story, and went so far as to replace the muslin curtain over the glazed door of the bathroom. Mr. Abney, moreover, to whom he confided his experiences at breakfast, was greatly interested, and made notes of the matter in what he called his book. The spring equinox was approaching, as Mr. Abney frequently reminded his cousin, adding that this had been always considered by the ancients to be a critical time for the young, that Stephen would do well to take care of himself, and to shut his bedroom window at night, and that Censorinus had some valuable remarks on the subject. Two incidents that occurred about this time made an impression upon Stephen's mind. The first was after an unusually uneasy and oppressed night that he had passed, though he could not recall any particular dream that he had had. The following evening, Mrs. Bunch was occupying herself in mending his nightgown. "Gracious me, Master Stephen," she broke forth rather irritably, "how do you manage to tear your night-dress all to flinders this way? Look here, sir, what trouble you do give to poor servants that have to darn and mend after you." There was, indeed, a most destructive and apparently wanton series of slits or scorings in the garment, which would undoubtedly require a skilful needle to make good. They were confined to the left side of the chest, long, parallel slits about 6 inches in length, some of them not quite piercing the texture of the linen. Stephen could only express his entire ignorance of their origin. He was sure they were not there the night before. "But," he said, "Mrs. Bunch, they are just the same as the scratches on the outside of my bedroom door, and I'm sure I never had anything to do with making them." Mrs. Bunch gazed at him open-mouthed, then snatched up a candle, departed hastily from the room, and was heard making her way upstairs. In a few minutes she came down. "Well," she said, "Master Stephen, it's a funny thing to me how them marks and scratches can have come there. Too high up for any cat or dog to have made 'em, much less a rat. For all the world like a Chinaman's fingernails, as my uncle in the tea trade used to tell us of when we was girls together. I wouldn't say nothing to master, not if I was you, Master Stephen, my dear. And just turn the key of the door when you go up to your bed." "I always do, Mrs. Bunch, as soon as I've said my prayers." "Ah, that's a good child. Always say your prayers, and then no one can't hurt you." Herewith Mrs. Bunch addressed herself to mending the injured nightgown, with intervals of meditation, until bedtime. This was on a Friday night in March, 1812. On the following evening, the usual duet of Stephen and Mrs. Bunch was augmented by the sudden arrival of Mr. Parkes, the butler, who as a rule kept himself rather to himself in his own pantry. He did not see that Stephen was there. He was moreover flustered, and less slow of speech than was his wont. "Master may get up his own wine if he likes of an evening," was his first remark. "Either I do it in the daytime or not at all, Mrs. Bunch. I don't know what it may be. Very like it's the rats, or the wind got into the cellars, but I'm not so young as I was, and I can't go through with it, as I have done." "Well, Mr. Parkes, you know it is a surprising place for the rats, is the Hall." "I am not denying that, Mrs. Bunch, and to be sure many a time I've heard the tale from the men in the shipyards about the rat that could speak. I never laid no confidence in that before, but tonight, if I'd demeaned myself to lay my ear on the door of the further bin, I could pretty much have heard what they were saying." "Oh, there, Mr. Parkes, I've no patience with your fancies. Rats talking in the wine cellar, indeed." "Well, Mrs. Bunch, I've no wish to argue with you. All I say is, if you choose to go to the far bin and lay your ear to the door, you may prove my words this minute." "What nonsense you do talk, Mr. Parkes. Not fit for children to listen to. Why, you'll be frightening Master Stephen there out of his wits." "What, Master Stephen?" said Parkes, awaking to the consciousness of the boy's presence. "Master Stephen knows well enough when I am playing a joke with you, Mrs. Bunch." In fact, Master Stephen knew much too well to suppose that Mr. Parkes had in the first instance intended a joke. He was interested, not altogether pleasantly, in the situation, but all his questions were unsuccessful in inducing the butler to give any more detailed account of his experiences in the wine cellar. We have now arrived at March the 24th, 1812. It was a day of curious experiences for Stephen. A windy, noisy day, which filled the house and the gardens with a restless impression. As Stephen stood by the fence of the grounds and looked out into the park, he felt as if an endless procession of unseen people was sweeping past him on the wind, borne on resistlessly and aimlessly, vainly striving to stop themselves, to catch at something that might arrest their flight and bring them once again into contact with the living world of which they had formed a part. After luncheon that day, Mr. Abney said, "Stephen, my boy, do you think you could manage to come to me tonight, as late as 11 o'clock in my study? I shall be busy until that time, and I wish to show you something connected with your future life, which it is most important that you should know. You're not to mention this matter to Mrs. Bunch, nor to anyone else in the house, and you had better go to your room at the usual time." Here was a new excitement added to life. Stephen eagerly grasped at the opportunity of sitting up till 11 o'clock. He looked in at the library door on his way upstairs that evening, and saw a brazier, which he had often noticed in the corner of the room, moved out before the fire. An old silver-gilt cup stood on the table, filled with red wine, and some written sheets of paper lay near it. Mr. Abney was sprinkling some incense on the brazier from a round silver box as Stephen passed, but did not seem to notice his step. The wind had fallen, and there was a still night and a full moon. At about 10 o'clock, Stephen was standing at the open window of his bedroom, looking out over the country. Still as the night was, the mysterious population of the distant moonlit woods was not yet lulled to rest. From time to time, strange cries, as of lost and despairing wanderers, sounded from across the mere. They might be the notes of owls or water-birds, yet they did not quite resemble either sound. Were they not coming nearer? Now they sounded from the nearer side of the water, and in a few moments they seemed to be floating about among the shrubberies. Then they ceased. But just as Stephen was thinking of shutting the window and resuming his reading of Robinson Crusoe, he caught sight of two figures standing on the gravelled terrace that ran along the garden side of the hall. The figures of a boy and girl, as it seemed. They stood side by side, looking up at the windows. Something in the form of the girl recalled irresistibly his dream of the figure in the bath. The boy inspired him with more acute fear. Whilst the girl stood still, half smiling, with her hands clasped over her heart, the boy, a thin shape, with black hair and ragged clothing, raised his arms in the air with an appearance of menace and of unappeasable hunger and longing. The moon shone upon his almost transparent hands, and Stephen saw that the nails were fearfully long, and that the light shone through them. As he stood with his arms thus raised, he disclosed a terrifying spectacle. On the left side of his chest there opened a black and gaping rent, and there fell upon Stephen's brain, rather than upon his ear, the impression of one of those hungry and desolate cries that he had heard resounding over the woods of Aswarby all that evening. In another moment this dreadful pair had moved swiftly and noiselessly over the dry gravel, and he saw them no more. Inexpressibly frightened as he was, he determined to take his candle and go down to Mr. Abney's study, for the hour appointed for their meeting was near at hand. The study, or library, opened out of the front hall on one side, and Stephen, urged on by his terrors, did not take long in getting there. To effect an entrance was not so easy. It was not locked, he felt sure, for the key was on the outside of the door as usual. His repeated knocks produced no answer. Mr. Abney was engaged. He was speaking. What? Why did he try to cry out? And why was the cry choked in his throat? Had he too seen the mysterious children? But now everything was quiet, and the door yielded to Stephen's terrified and frantic pushing. On the table in Mr. Abney's study, certain papers were found which explained the situation to Stephen Elliott when he was of an age to understand them. The most important sentences were as follows. It was a belief very strongly and generally held by the ancients, of whose wisdom in these matters I have had such experience as induces me to place confidence in their assertions, that by enacting certain processes, which to us moderns have something of a barbaric complexion, a very remarkable enlightenment of the spiritual faculties in man may be attained. That, for example, by absorbing the personalities of a certain number of his fellow creatures, an individual may gain a complete ascendancy over those orders of spiritual beings which control the elemental forces of our universe. It is recorded of Simon Magus that he was able to fly in the air, to become invisible, or to assume any form he pleased, by the agency of the soul of a boy whom, to use the libellous phrase employed by the author of the Clementine Recognitions, he had murdered. I find it set down, moreover, with considerable detail in the writings of Hermes Trismegistus, that similar happy results may be produced by the absorption of the hearts of not less than 3 human beings below the age of 21 years. To the testing of the truth of this recipe I have devoted the greater part of the last 20 years, selecting as the corpora vilia of my experiment such persons as could conveniently be removed without occasioning a sensible gap in society. The first step I effected by the removal of one Phoebe Stanley, a girl of gipsy extraction, on March the 22nd, 1792. The second by the removal of a wandering Italian lad named Giovanni Paoli, on the night of March the 23rd, 1805. The final victim, to employ a word repugnant in the highest degree to my feelings, must be my cousin Stephen Elliott. His day must be this March 24th, 1812. The best means of effecting the required absorption is to remove the heart from the living subject, to reduce it to ashes, and to mingle them with about a pint of some red wine, preferably port. The remains of the first 2 subjects, at least, it will be well to conceal. A disused bathroom or wine cellar will be found convenient for such a purpose. Some annoyance may be experienced from the psychic portion of the subjects, which popular language dignifies with the name of ghosts, but the man of philosophic temperament, to whom alone the experiment is appropriate, will be little prone to attach importance to the feeble efforts of these beings to wreak their vengeance on him. I contemplate with the liveliest satisfaction the enlarged and emancipated existence which the experiment, if successful, will confer on me, not only placing me beyond the reach of human justice, so-called, but eliminating, to a great extent, the prospect of death itself. Mr. Abney was found in his chair, his head thrown back, his face stamped with an expression of rage, fright, and mortal pain. In his left side was a terrible lacerated wound, exposing the heart. There was no blood on his hands, and a long knife that lay on the table was perfectly clean. A savage wildcat might have inflicted the injuries. The window of the study was open, and it was the opinion of the coroner that Mr. Abney had met his death by the agency of some wild creature. But Stephen Elliott's study of the papers I have quoted led him to a very different conclusion. End of Lost Hearts. The Mezzotint. Some time ago, I believe I had the pleasure of telling you the story of an adventure which happened to a friend of mine by the name of Denniston during his pursuit of objects of art for the museum at Cambridge. He did not publish his experiences very widely upon his return to England, but they could not fail to become known to a good many of his friends, and among others to the gentleman who at that time presided over an art museum at another university. It was to be expected that the story should make a considerable impression on the mind of a man whose vocation lay in lines similar to Denniston's, and that he should be eager to catch at any explanation of the matter which tended to make it seem improbable that he should ever be called upon to deal with so agitating an emergency. It was indeed somewhat consoling to him to reflect that he was not expected to acquire ancient manuscripts for his institution. That was the business of the Shelburnian Library. The authorities of that institution might, if they pleased, ransack obscure corners of the continent for such matters. He was glad to be obliged at the moment to confine his attention to enlarging the already unsurpassed collection of English topographical drawings and engravings possessed by his museum. Yet, as it turned out, even a department so homely and familiar as this may have its dark corners, and to one of these Mr. Williams was unexpectedly introduced. Those who have taken even the most limited interest in the acquisition of topographical pictures are aware that there is one London dealer whose aid is indispensable to their researches. Mr. J. W. Britnell publishes at short intervals very admirable catalogues of a large and constantly changing stock of engravings, plans, and old sketches of mansions, churches, and towns in England and Wales. These catalogues were, of course, the ABC of his subject to Mr. Williams, but as his museum already contained an enormous accumulation of topographical pictures, he was a regular rather than a copious buyer, and he rather looked to Mr. Britnell to fill up gaps in the rank and file of his collection than to supply him with rarities. Now, in February of last year, there appeared upon Mr. Williams's desk at the museum a catalogue from Mr. Britnell's Emporium, and accompanying it was a typewritten communication from the dealer himself. This letter ran as follows: Dear Sir, we beg to call your attention to number 978 in our accompanying catalogue, which we shall be glad to send on approval. Yours faithfully, J. W. Britnell. To turn to number 978 in the accompanying catalogue was, with Mr. Williams, as he observed to himself, the work of a moment, and in the place indicated he found the following entry: 978. Unknown. Interesting mezzotint. View of a manor house, early part of the century, 15 by 10 inches, black frame, £2 2s. It was not specially exciting, and the price seemed high. However, as Mr. Britnell, who knew his business and his customer, seemed to set store by it, Mr. Williams wrote a postcard asking for the article to be sent on approval, along with some other engravings and sketches which appeared in the same catalogue. And so he passed without much excitement of anticipation to the ordinary labours of the day. A parcel of any kind always arrives a day later than you expect it, and that of Mr. Britnell proved, as I believe the right phrase goes, no exception to the rule. It was delivered at the museum by the afternoon post of Saturday, after Mr. Williams had left his work, and it was accordingly brought round to his rooms in college by the attendant, in order that he might not have to wait over Sunday before looking through it, and returning such of the contents as he did not propose to keep. And here he found it when he came in to tea with a friend. The only item with which I am concerned was the rather large black-framed mezzotint, of which I have already quoted the short description given in Mr. Britnell's catalogue. Some more details of it will have to be given, though I cannot hope to put before you the look of the picture as clearly as it is present to my own eye. Very nearly the exact duplicate of it may be seen in a good many old inn parlours, or in the passages of undisturbed country mansions at the present moment. It was a rather indifferent mezzotint, and an indifferent mezzotint is perhaps the worst form of engraving known. It presented a full-face view of a not very large manor house of the last century, with 3 rows of plain sashed windows with rusticated masonry about them, a parapet with balls or vases at the angles, and a small portico in the centre. On either side were trees, and in front a considerable expanse of lawn. The legend A.W.F. Sculpsit was engraved on the narrow margin, and there was no further inscription. The whole thing gave the impression that it was the work of an amateur. What in the world Mr. Britnell could mean by affixing the price of 2 guineas to such an object was more than Mr. Williams could imagine. He turned it over with a good deal of contempt. Upon the back was a paper label, the left-hand half of which had been torn off. All that remained were the ends of 2 lines of writing. The first had the letters Ngley Hall, Ngley, Hall. The second SSEX. It would perhaps be just worthwhile to identify the place represented, which he could easily do with the help of a gazetteer, and then he would send it back to Mr. Britnell with some remarks reflecting upon the judgment of that gentleman. He lighted the candles, for it was now dark, made the tea, and supplied the friend with whom he had been playing golf, for I believe the authorities of the university I write of indulge in that pursuit by way of relaxation, and tea was taken to the accompaniment of a discussion which golfing persons can imagine for themselves, but which the conscientious writer has no right to inflict upon any non-golfing persons. The conclusion arrived at was that certain strokes might have been better, and that in certain emergencies neither player had experienced that amount of luck which a human being has a right to expect. It was now that the friend, let us call him Professor Binks, took up the framed engraving and said, "What's this place, Williams?" "Just what I was going to try to find out," said Williams, going to the shelf for a gazetteer. "Look at the back. Somethingly Hall, either in Sussex or Essex. Half the name's gone, you see. You don't happen to know it, I suppose?" "It's from that man Britnell, I suppose, isn't it?" said Binks. "Is it for the museum?" "Well, I think I should buy it if the price was 5 shillings, said Williams. "But for some unearthly reason he wants 2 guineas for it. I can't conceive why. It's a wretched engraving, and there aren't even any figures to give it life." "It's not worth 2 guineas, I should think," said Binks. "But I don't think it's so badly done. The moonlight seems rather good to me, and I should have thought that there were figures, or at least a figure, just on the edge in front." "Let's look," said Williams. "Well, it's true the light is rather cleverly given. Where's your figure? Oh, yes, just the head in the very front of the picture." And indeed there was, hardly more than a black blot on the extreme edge of the engraving, the head of a man or woman, a good deal muffled up, the back turned to the spectator, and looking towards the house. Williams had not noticed it before. "Still," he said, "though it's a cleverer thing than I thought, I can't spend 2 guineas of museum money on a picture of a place I don't know." Professor Binks had his work to do, and soon went, and very nearly up to Hall time Williams was engaged in a vain attempt to identify the subject of his picture. If the vowel before the ng had only been left, it would have been easy enough, he thought, but as it is, the name may be anything from Guestingley to Langley, and there are many more names ending like this than I thought, and this rotten book has no index of terminations. hall in Mr. Williams's college was at 7. It need not be dwelt upon. The less so as he met there colleagues who had been playing golf during the afternoon, and words with which we have no concern were freely bandied across the table. Merely golfing words, I would hasten to explain. I suppose an hour or more to have been spent in what is called common room, after dinner. Later in the evening, some few retired to Williams's rooms, and I have little doubt that whist was played and tobacco smoked. During a lull in these operations, Williams picked up the mezzotint from the table without looking at it, and handed it to a person mildly interested in art, telling him where it had come from, and the other particulars which we already know. The gentleman took it carelessly, looked at it, then said, in a tone of some interest, "It's really a very good piece of work, Williams. It has quite a feeling of the romantic period. The light is admirably managed, it seems to me, and the figure, though it's rather too grotesque, is somehow very impressive." "Yes, isn't it?" said Williams, who was just then busy giving whisky and soda to others of the company, and was unable to come across the room to look at the view again. It was by this time rather late in the evening, and the visitors were on the move. After they went, Williams was obliged to write a letter or two and clear up some odd bits of work. At last, some time past midnight, he was disposed to turn in, and he put out his lamp after lighting his bedroom candle. The picture lay face upwards on the table where the last man who looked at it had put it, and it caught his eye as he turned the lamp down. What he saw made him very nearly drop the candle on the floor, and he declares now, if he had been left in the dark at that moment, he would have had a fit. But as that did not happen, he was able to put down the light on the table and to take a good look at the picture. It was indubitably, rankly impossible, no doubt, but absolutely certain. In the middle of the lawn, in front of the unknown house, there was a figure where no figure had been at 5 o'clock that afternoon. It was crawling on all fours towards the house, and it was muffled in a strange black garment, with a white cross on the back. I do not know what is the ideal course to pursue in a situation of this kind. I can only tell you what Mr. Williams did. He took the picture by one corner and carried it across the passage to a second set of rooms which he possessed. There he locked it up in a drawer, sported the doors of both rooms, and retired to bed. But first he wrote out and signed an account of the extraordinary change which the picture had undergone since it had come into his possession. Sleep visited him rather late, but it was consoling to reflect that the behaviour of the picture did not depend upon his own unsupported testimony. Evidently the man who had looked at it the night before had seen something of the same kind as he had, otherwise he might have been tempted to think that something gravely wrong was happening, either to his eyes or his mind. This possibility being fortunately precluded, two matters awaited him on the morrow. He must take stock of the picture very carefully, and call in a witness for the purpose, and he must make a determined effort to ascertain what house it was that was represented. He would therefore ask his neighbour Nisbet to breakfast with him, and he would subsequently spend the morning over the Gazetteer. Nisbet was disengaged, and arrived about 9:20. His host was not quite dressed, I'm sorry to say, even at this late hour. During breakfast nothing was said about the mezzotint by Williams, save that he had a picture on which he wished for Nisbet's opinion. But those who are familiar with university life can picture for themselves the wide and delightful range of subjects over which the conversation of two fellows of Canterbury College is likely to extend during a Sunday morning breakfast. Hardly a topic was left unchallenged, from golf to lawn tennis. Yet I am bound to say that Williams was rather distraught, for his interest naturally centred in that very strange picture which was now reposing face downwards in the drawer in the room opposite. The morning pipe was at last lighted, and the moment had arrived for which he looked. With very considerable, almost tremulous excitement, he ran across, unlocked the drawer, and extracting the picture, still face downwards, ran back and put it into Nisbet's hands. "Now," he said, "Nisbet, I want you to tell me exactly what you see in that picture. Describe it, if you don't mind, rather minutely. I'll tell you why afterwards." "Well," said Nisbet, "I have here a view of a country house, English, I presume, by moonlight." "Moonlight? You're sure of that?" "Certainly. The moon appears to be on the wane, if you wish for details, and there are clouds in the sky." "All right, go on." "I'll swear," added Williams in an aside, "there was no moon when I saw it first." "Well, there's not much more to be said," Nisbet continued. "The house has 3 rows of windows, 5 in each row, except at the bottom, where there's a porch instead of the middle one, and "But what about figures?" said Williams with marked interest. "There aren't any," said Nisbet. "But what? No figure on the grass in front?" "Not a thing." "You'll swear to that?" "Certainly I will. But there's just one other thing." "What?" "Why, one of the windows on the ground floor, left of the door, is open." "Is it really so? My goodness! He must have got in," said Williams with great excitement, and he hurried to the back of the sofa on which Nisbet was sitting, and catching the picture from him, verified the matter for himself. It was quite true. There was no figure, and there was the open window. Williams, after a moment of speechless surprise, went to the writing table and scribbled for a short time. Then he brought 2 papers to Nisbet and asked him first to sign one. It was his own description of the picture, which you have just heard, and then to read the other, which was William's statement written the night before. "What can it all mean?" said Nisbet. "Exactly," said Williams. "Well, one thing I must do, or 3 things now I think of it. I must find out from Garwood," this was his last night's visitor, "what he saw. And then I must get the thing photographed before it goes further. And then I must find out what the place is." "I can do the photographing myself," said Nisbet, "and I will. But, you know, it looks very much as if we were assisting at the working out of a tragedy somewhere. The question is, has it happened already, or is it going to come off? You must find out what the place is. Yes," he said, looking at the picture again, "I expect you're right. He has got in, and if I don't mistake, there'll be the devil to pay in one of the rooms upstairs." "I'll tell you what," said Williams. "I'll take the picture across to old Green." This was the senior fellow of the college, who had been bursar for many years. "It's quite likely he'll know it. We have property in Essex and Sussex, and he must have been over the 2 counties a lot in his time." "Quite likely he will," said Nisbet, "but just let me take my photograph first. But look here, I rather think Green isn't up today. He wasn't in Hall last night, and I think I heard him say he was going down for the Sunday." "That's true too," said Williams. "I know he's gone to Brighton. Well, if you'll photograph it now, I'll go across to Garwood and get his statement. And you keep an eye on it while I'm gone. I'm beginning to think 2 guineas is not a very exorbitant price for it now." In a short time he had returned, and brought Mr. Garwood with him. Garwood's statement was to the effect that the figure, when he had seen it, was clear of the edge of the picture, but had not got far across the lawn. He remembered a white mark on the back of its drapery, but could not have been sure it was a cross. A document to this effect was then drawn up and signed, and Nisbet proceeded to photograph the picture. "Now what do you want to do?" he said. "Are you going to sit and watch it all day?" "Well, "No, I think not," said Williams. "I rather imagine we're meant to see the whole thing. You see, between the time I saw it last night and this morning, there was time for lots of things to happen, but the creature only got into the house. It could easily have got through its business in the time and gone to its own place again, but the fact of the window being open, I think, must mean that it's in there now. So I feel quite easy about leaving it. And besides, I have a kind of idea that it wouldn't change much, if at all, in the daytime. We might go out for a walk this afternoon, and come in to tea, or whenever it gets dark. I shall leave it out on the table here, and sport the door. My skip can get in, but no one else." The three agreed that this would be a good plan, and further, that if they spent the afternoon together they would be less likely to talk about the business to other people, for any rumour of such a transaction as was going on would bring the whole of the Phasmatological Society about their ears. We may give them a respite until 5 o'clock. At or near that hour, the three were entering Williams's staircase. They were at first slightly annoyed to see that the door of his rooms was unsported, but in a moment it was remembered that on Sunday the skips came for orders an hour or so earlier than on weekdays. However, a surprise was awaiting them. The first thing they saw was the picture leaning up against a pile of books on the table, as it had been left, and the next thing was Williams's skip, seated on a chair opposite, gazing at it with undisguised horror. How was this? Mr. Filcher, the name is not my own invention, was a servant of considerable standing, and set the standards of etiquette to all his own college and to several neighbouring ones, and nothing could be more alien to his practice than to be found sitting on his master's chair, or appearing to take any particular notice of his master's furniture or pictures. Indeed, he seemed to feel this himself. He started violently when the three men were in the room, and got up with a marked effort. Then he said, "I ask your pardon, sir, for taking such a freedom as to sit down." "Not at all, Robert," interposed Mr. Williams. "I was meaning to ask you some time what you thought of that picture." "Well, sir, of course I don't set up my opinion against yours, but it ain't the picture I should hang where my little girl could see it, sir." "Wouldn't you, Robert? Why not?" "No, sir. Why, the poor child, I recollect once she sees a door Bible with pictures not half what that is, and we had to set up with her 3 or 4 nights afterwards, if you'll believe me. And if she was to catch a sight of this skeleton here, or whatever it is, carrying off the poor baby, she would be in a taking. You know how it is with children, how nervous they get with a little thing and all. But what I should say, it don't seem a right picture to be laying about, sir, not where anyone that's liable to be startled could come on it. Should you be wanting anything this evening, sir?" "Thank you, sir." With these words, the excellent man went to continue the round of his masters, and you may be sure the gentleman whom he left lost no time in gathering round the engraving. There was the house, as before, under the waning moon and the drifting clouds. The window that had been open was shut, and the figure was once more on the lawn, but not, this time, crawling cautiously on hands and knees. Now it was erect, and stepping swiftly with long strides towards the front of the picture. The moon was behind it, and the black drapery hung down over its face, so that only hints of that could be seen, and what was visible made the spectators profoundly thankful that they could see no more than a white, dome-like forehead and a few straggling hairs. The head was bent down, and the arms were tightly clasped over an object which could be dimly seen and identified as a child. Whether dead or living it was not possible to say. The legs of the appearance alone could be plainly discerned, and they were horribly thin. From 5 to 7, the three companions sat and watched the picture by turns, but it never changed. They agreed at last that it would be safe to leave it, and that they would return after Hall and await further developments. When they assembled again, at the earliest possible moment, the engraving was there, but the figure was gone, and the house was quiet under the moonbeams. There was nothing for it but to spend the evening over gazetteers and guidebooks. Williams was the lucky one at last, and perhaps he deserved it. At 11:30 p.m. he read from Murray's Guide to Essex the following lines: 16½ miles, Anningley. The church has been an interesting building of Norman date, but was extensively classicised in the last century. It contains the tomb of the family of Francis, whose mansion Anningley Hall, a solid Queen Anne house, stands immediately beyond the churchyard in a park of about 80 acres. The family is now extinct, the last heir having disappeared mysteriously in infancy in the year 1802. The father, Mr. Arthur Francis, was locally known as a talented amateur engraver in mezzotint. After his son's disappearance, he lived in complete retirement at the Hall, and was found dead in his studio on the 3rd anniversary of the disaster, having just completed an engraving of the house, impressions of which are of considerable rarity. This looked like business, and indeed Mr. Green on his return at once identified the house as Anningley Hall. "Is there any kind of explanation of the figure, Green?" was the question which Williams naturally asked. "I don't know, I'm sure, Williams. What used to be said in the place when I first knew it, which was before I came up here, was just this. Old Francis was always very much down on these poaching fellows, and whenever he got a chance he used to get a man whom he suspected of it turned off the estate, and by degrees he got rid of them all but one. Squires could do a lot of things then that they daren't think of now. Well, this man that was left was what you find pretty often in that country. The last remains of a very old family. I believe they were lords of the manor at one time. I recollect just the same thing in my own parish." "What, like the man in Tessa the d'Urbervilles?" Williams put in. "Yes, I dare say. It's not a book I could ever read myself, but this fellow could show a row of tombs in the church there that belonged to his ancestors, and all that went to sour him a bit. But Francis, they said, could never get at him. He always kept just on the right side of the law, until one night the keepers found him at it in a wood right at the end of the estate. I could show you the place now. It marches with some land that used to belong to an uncle of mine. And you can imagine there was a row. And this man Gaudy, that was the name, to be sure, Gaudy. I thought I should get it. Gaudy. He was unlucky enough, poor chap, to shoot a keeper. Well, that was what Francis wanted. And grand juries, you know what they would have been then. And poor Gaudy was strung up in double quick time. And I've been showed the place he was buried in, on the north side of the church. You know the way in that part of the world. Anyone that's been hanged or made away with themselves, they bury them that side. And the idea was that some friend of Gaudy's, not a relation, because he had none, poor devil, he was the last of his line, kind of spes ultima gentis, must have planned to get hold of Francis's boy and put an end to his line too. I don't know. It's rather an out-of-the-way thing for an Essex poacher to think of, but, you know, I should say now it looks more as if old Gaudy had managed the job himself. Ugh, I hate to think of it. Have some whisky, Williams." The facts were communicated by Williams to Denniston, and by him to a mixed company of which I was one, and the Sadducean professor of ophiology another. I am sorry to say that the latter, when asked what he thought of it, only remarked, "Oh, those Bridgeford people will say anything," a sentiment which met with the reception it deserved. I have only to add that the picture is now in the Ashleighan Museum, that it has been treated with a view to discovering whether sympathetic ink has been used in it, but without effect, that Mr. Britnell knew nothing of it, save that he was sure it was uncommon, and that, though carefully watched, it has never been known to change again. End of the mezzotint. The Ash Tree. Everyone who has travelled over eastern England knows the smaller country houses with which it is studded. The rather dank little buildings, usually in the Italian style, surrounded with parks of some 80 to 100 acres. For me, they have always had a very strong attraction, with the grey paling of split oak, the noble trees, the meres with their reed beds, and the line of distant woods. Then I like the pillared portico, perhaps stuck on to a red brick Queen Anne house, which has been faced with stucco to bring it into line with the Grecian taste of the end of the 18th century. The hall inside, going up to the roof, which hall ought always to be provided with a gallery and a small organ. I like the library, too, where you may find anything from a Psalter of the 13th century to a Shakespeare quarto. I like the pictures, of course, and, perhaps most of all, I like fancying what life in such a house was when it was first built, and in the piping times of landlord's prosperity, and not least now, when, if money is not so plentiful, taste is more varied, and life quite as interesting. I wish to have one of these houses, and enough money to keep it together, and entertain my friends in it modestly. But this is a digression. I have to tell you of a curious series of events which happened in such a house as I have tried to describe. It is Castringham Hall, in Suffolk. I think a good deal has been done to the building since the period of my story, but the essential features I have sketched are still there. Italian portico, square block of white house, older inside than out, park with fringe of woods, and mere. The one feature that marked out the house from a score of others is gone. As you looked at it from the park, you saw on the right a great old ash tree, growing within half a dozen yards of the wall, and almost or quite touching the building with its branches. I suppose it had stood there ever since Castringham ceased to be a fortified place, and since the moat was filled in and the Elizabethan dwelling-house built. At any rate, it had well nigh attained its full dimensions in the year 1690. In that year, the district in which the hall is situated was the scene of a number of witch trials. It will be long, I think, before we arrive at a just estimate of the amount of solid reason, if there was any, which lay at the root of the universal fear of witches in old times. Whether the persons accused of this offence really did imagine that they were possessed of unusual power of any kind, or whether they had the will at least, if not the power, of doing mischief to their neighbours, or whether all the confessions, of which there are so many, were extorted by the cruelty of the witch-finders. These are questions which are not, I fancy, yet solved, and the present narrative gives me pause. I cannot altogether sweep it away as mere invention. The reader must judge for himself. Castringham contributed a victim to the auto-da-fe. Mrs. Mothersole was her name, and she differed from the ordinary run of village witches only in being rather better off, and in a more influential position. Efforts were made to save her by several reputable farmers of the parish. They did their best to testify to her character, and showed considerable anxiety as to the verdict of the jury. But what seems to have been fatal to the woman was the evidence of the then proprietor of Castringham Hall, Sir Matthew Fell. He deposed to having watched her on 3 different occasions from his window at the full of the moon, gathering sprigs from the ash tree near my house. She had climbed into the branches, clad only in her shift, and was cutting off small twigs with a peculiarly curved knife, and as she did so, she seemed to be talking to herself. On each occasion, Sir Matthew had done his best to capture the woman, but she had always taken alarm at some accidental noise he had made, and all he could see when he got down to the garden was a hare running across the path in the direction of the village. On the third night, he had been at pains to follow at his best speed, and had gone straight to Mrs. Mothersole's house, but he had had to wait a quarter of an hour battering at her door, and then she had come out very cross and apparently very sleepy, as if just out of bed, and he had no good explanation to offer of his visit. Mainly on this evidence, though there was much more of a less striking and unusual kind from other parishioners, Mrs. Mothersole was found guilty and condemned to die. She was hanged a week after the trial, with 5 or 6 more unhappy creatures, at Bury St. Edmunds. Sir Matthew Fell, then Deputy Sheriff, was present at the execution. It was a damp, drizzly March morning when the cart made its way up the rough grass hill outside Northgate, where the gallows stood. The other victims were apathetic or broken down with misery, but Mrs. Mothersole was, as in life so in death, of a very different temper. Her poisonous rage, as a reporter of the time put it, did so work upon the bystanders, yea, even upon the hangman, that it was constantly affirmed of all that saw her that she presented the living aspect of a mad devil, yet she offered no resistance to the officers of the law. Only she looked upon those that laid hands upon her with so direful and venomous an aspect that, as one of them afterwards assured me, the mere thought of it preyed inwardly upon his mind for 6 months after. However, all that she is reported to have said were the seemingly meaningless words, "There will be guests at the hall," which she repeated more than once in an undertone. Sir Matthew Fell was not unimpressed by the bearing of the woman. He had some talk upon the matter with the vicar of his parish, with whom he travelled home after the assize business was over. His evidence at the trial had not been very willingly given. He was not specially infected with the witch-finding mania, but he declared then and afterwards that he could not give any other account of the matter than that he had given, and that he could not possibly have been mistaken as to what he saw. The whole transaction had been repugnant to him, for he was a man who liked to be on pleasant terms with those about him, but he saw a duty to be done in this business, and he had done it. That seems to have been the gist of his sentiments, and the vicar applauded it, as any reasonable man must have done. A few weeks after, when the moon of May was at the full, vicar and squire met again in the park, and walked to the hall together. Lady Fell was with her mother, who was dangerously ill, and Sir Matthew was alone at home. So the vicar, Mr. Crome, was easily persuaded to take a late supper at the hall. Sir Matthew was not very good company this evening. The talk ran chiefly on family and parish matters, and as luck would have it, Sir Matthew made a memorandum in writing of certain wishes or intentions of his regarding his estates, which afterwards proved exceedingly useful. When Mr. Crome thought of starting for home, about 9:30, Sir Matthew and he took a preliminary turn on the gravelled walk at the back of the house. The only incident that struck Mr. Crome was this. They were in sight of the ash tree which I described as growing near the windows of the building, when Sir Matthew stopped and said, "What is that runs up and down the stem of the ash? It is never a squirrel. They will all be in their nests by now." The vicar looked and saw the moving creature, but he could make nothing of its colour in the moonlight. The sharp outline, however, seen for an instant, was imprinted on his brain, and he could have sworn, he said, though it sounded foolish, that, squirrel or not, it had more than 4 legs. Still, not much was to be made of the momentary vision, and the 2 men parted. They may have met since then, but it was not for a score of years. Next day Sir Matthew Fell was not downstairs at 6 in the morning, as was his custom, nor at 7, nor yet at 8. Hereupon the servants went and knocked at his chamber door. I need not prolong the description of their anxious listenings and renewed batterings on the panels. The door was opened at last from the outside, and they found their master dead and black. So much you have guessed. That there were any marks of violence did not at the moment appear, but the window was open. One of the men went to fetch the parson, and then by his directions rode on to give notice to the coroner. Mr. Crow himself went as quick as he might to the hall, and was shown to the room where the dead man lay. He has left some notes among his papers, which show how genuine a respect and sorrow was felt for Sir Matthew. And there is also this passage, which I transcribe for the sake of the light it throws upon the course of events, and also upon the common beliefs of the time. There was not any the least trace of an entrance having been forced to the chamber, but the casement stood open, as my poor friend would always have it in this season. He had his evening drink of small ale in a silver vessel of about a pint measure, and tonight had not drunk it out. This drink was examined by the physician from Bury, a Mr. Hodgkins, who could not, however, as he afterwards declared upon his oath before the coroner's quest, discover that any matter of a venomous kind was present in it, for, as was natural, in the great swelling and blackness of the corpse there was talk made among the neighbours of poison. The body was very much disordered as it lay in the bed, being twisted after so extreme a sort as gave too probable conjecture that my worthy friend and patron had expired in great pain and agony. And what is as yet unexplained, and to myself the argument of some horrible and artful design in the perpetrators of this barbarous murder, was this, that the women which were entrusted with the laying out of the corpse and washing it, being both sad persons and very well respected in their mournful profession, came to me in a great pain and distress, both of mind and body, saying, what was indeed confirmed upon the first view, that they had no sooner touched the breast of the corpse with their naked hands than they were sensible of a more than ordinary violent smart and aching in their palms, which with their whole forearms in no long time swelled so immoderately, the pain still continuing, that, as afterwards proved, during many weeks they were forced to lay by the exercise of their calling, and yet no mark seen on the skin. Upon hearing this, I sent for the physician, who was still in the house, and we made as careful a proof as we were able by the help of a small magnifying lens of crystal, of the condition of the skin in this part of the body, but could not detect with the instrument we had any matter of importance beyond a couple of small punctures or pricks, which we then concluded were the spots by which the poison might be introduced, remembering that ring of Pope Borgia, with other known specimens of the horrible art of the Italian poisoners of the last age. So much is to be said of the symptoms seen on the corpse. As to what I am to add, it is merely my own experiment, and to be left to posterity to judge whether there be anything of value therein. There was on the table by the bedside a Bible of the small size, in which my friend, punctual as in the matters of less moment, so in this more weighty one, used nightly, and upon his first rising, to read a set portion, and I, taking it up, not without a tear duly paid to him which from the study of this poorer adumbration was now passed to the contemplation of its great original, it came into my thoughts, as at such moments of helplessness we are prone to catch at any the least glimmer that makes promise of light, to make trial of that old, and by many accounted superstitious, practice of drawing the sortes, of which a principal instance, in the case of his late sacred majesty the blessed martyr King Charles, and my Lord Falkland, was now much talked of. I must needs admit that by my trial not much assistance was afforded me. Yet, as the cause and origin of these dreadful events may hereafter be searched out, I set down the results. In the case it may be found that they pointed the true quarter of the mischief to a quicker intelligence than my own. I made, then, 3 trials, opening the book and placing my finger upon certain words, which gave in the first these words, from Luke 13, verse 7. Cut it down, in the second, Isaiah 13, verse 20. It shall never be inhabited. And upon the third experiment, Job 39, verse 30, her young ones also suck up blood. This is all that need be quoted from Mr. Crome's papers. Sir Matthew Fell was duly coffined and laid into the earth, and his funeral sermon, preached by Mr. Crome on the following Sunday, has been printed under the title of The Unsearchable Way, or England's Danger and the Malicious Dealings of Antichrist. It being the vicar's view, as well as that most commonly held in the neighbourhood, that the squire was a victim of a recrudescence of the popish plot. His son, Sir Matthew II, succeeded to the title and estates, and so ends the first act of the Castringham tragedy. It is to be mentioned, though the fact is not surprising, that the new baronet did not occupy the room in which his father had died, nor indeed was it slept in by anyone but an occasional visitor during the whole of his occupation. He died in 1735, and I do not find that anything particular marked his reign, save a curiously constant mortality among his cattle and livestock in general, which showed a tendency to increase slightly as time went on. Those who are interested in the details will find a statistical account in a letter to the Gentleman's Magazine of 1772, which draws the facts from the baronet's own papers. He put an end to it at last by a very simple expedient, that of shutting up all his beasts in sheds at night, and keeping no sheep in his park, for he had noticed that nothing was ever attacked that spent the night indoors. After that, the disorder confined itself to wild birds and beasts of chase. But as we have no good account of the symptoms, and as all-night watching was quite unproductive of any clue, I do not dwell on what the Suffolk farmers called the Castringham sickness. The second Sir Matthew died in 1735, as I said, and was duly succeeded by his son, Sir Richard. It was in his time that the great family pew was built out on the north side of the parish church. So large were the squire's ideas that several of the graves on that unhallowed side of the building had to be disturbed to satisfy his requirements. Among them was that of Mrs. Mothersole, the position of which was accurately known, thanks to a note on a plan of the church and yard, both made by Mr. Crome. A certain amount of interest was excited in the village when it was known that the famous witch, who was still remembered by a few, was to be exhumed, and the feeling of surprise and, indeed, disquiet was very strong when it was found that, though her coffin was fairly sound and unbroken, there was no trace whatever inside it of body, bones, or dust. Indeed, it is a curious phenomenon, for at the time of her burying no such things were dreamt of as resurrection men, and it is difficult to conceive any rational motive for stealing a body otherwise than for the uses of the dissecting room. The incident revived for a time all the stories of witch trials and of the exploits of the witches, dormant for 40 years, and Sir Richard's orders that the coffin should be burnt were thought by a good many to be rather foolhardy, though they were duly carried out. Sir Richard was a pestilent innovator, it is certain. Before his time, the hall had been a fine block of the mellowest red brick, but Sir Richard had travelled in Italy, and became infected with the Italian taste, and having more money than his predecessors, he determined to leave an Italian palace where he had found an English house. So stucco and ashlar masked the brick, Some indifferent Roman marbles were planted about in the entrance hall and gardens. A reproduction of the Sibyl's Temple at Tivoli was erected on the opposite bank of the mere, and Castringham took on an entirely new and, I must say, a less engaging aspect. But it was much admired, and served as a model to a good many of the neighbouring gentry in after years. One morning, it was in 1754, Sir Richard woke after a night of discomfort. It had been windy, and his chimney had smoked persistently, and yet it was so cold that he must keep up a fire. Also, something had so rattled about the window that no man could get a moment's peace. Further, there was the prospect of several guests of position arriving in the course of the day, who would expect sport of some kind, and the inroads of the distemper, which continued among his game, had been lately so serious that he was afraid for his reputation as a game preserver. But what really touched him most nearly was the other matter of his sleepless night. He could certainly not sleep in that room again. That was the chief subject of his meditations at breakfast, and after it he began a systematic examination of the rooms to see which would suit his notions best. It was long before he found one. This had a window with an eastern aspect, and that the northern. This door the servants would always be passing, and he did not like the bedstead in that. No, he must have a room with a western lookout, so that the sun could not wake him early, and it must be out of the way of the business of the house. The housekeeper was at the end of her resources. "Well, Sir Richard," she said, "you know that there is but the one room like that in the house." "Which may that be?" said Sir Richard. "And that is Sir Matthew's, the west chamber." "Well, put me in there, for there I'll lie tonight," said her master. "Which way is it?" "Here, to be sure." And he hurried off. "Oh, Sir Richard, but no one has slept there these 40 years. The air has hardly been changed since Sir Matthew died there." Thus she spoke, and rustled after him. "Come, open the door, Mrs. Chiddock. I'll see the chamber at least." So it was opened, and indeed the smell was very close and earthy. Sir Richard crossed to the window, and impatiently, as was his wont, threw the shutters back and flung open the casement. For this end of the house was one which the alterations had barely touched, grown up as it was with the great ash-tree, and being otherwise concealed from view. "Air it, Mrs. Chiddock, all to-day, and move my bed furniture in the afternoon. Put the Bishop of Kilmore in my old room." "Pray, Sir Richard," said a new voice, breaking in on this speech, "might I have the favour of a moment's interview?" Sir Richard turned round and saw a man in black in the doorway, who bowed. "I must ask your indulgence for this intrusion, Sir Richard. You will perhaps hardly remember me. My name is William Crone, and my grandfather was vicar in your grandfather's time." "Well, sir," said Sir Richard, "the name of Crone is always a passport to Castringham. I'm glad to renew a friendship of 2 generations' standing. In what can I serve you? For your hour of calling, and if I do not mistake you, your bearing, shows you to be in some haste." "That is no more than the truth, sir. I am riding from Norwich to Bury St. Edmunds, with what haste I can make, and I have called in on my way to leave you with some papers, which we have but just come upon in looking over what my grandfather left at his death. It is thought you may find some matters of family interest in them." "You are mighty obliging, Mr. Crone, and if you will be so good as to follow me to the parlour, and drink a glass of wine, we will take a first look at these papers together. And you, Mrs. Chiddock, as I said, be about airing this chamber." "Yes, it is here my grandfather died." "Yes, the tree perhaps does make the place a little dampish. No, I do not wish to listen to any more. Make no difficulties, I beg. You have your orders. Go. Will you follow me, sir?" He went to the study. The packet which young Mr. Crome had brought, he was then just become a fellow of Clare Hall in Cambridge, I may say, and subsequently brought out a respectable edition of Polyenus, contained, among other things, the notes which the old vicar had made upon the occasion of Sir Matthew Fell's death. And for the first time, Sir Richard was confronted with the enigmatical Sortes Biblici, which you have heard. They amused him a good deal. "Well," he said, "my grandfather's Bible gave one prudent piece of advice: cut it down. If that stands for the ash tree, he may rest assured I shall not neglect it. Such a nest of catarrhs and agues was never seen." The parlour contained the family books, which, pending the arrival of a collection which Sir Richard had made in Italy, and the building of a proper room to receive them, were not many in number. Sir Richard looked up from the paper to the bookcase. "I wonder," says he, "whether the old prophet is there yet. I fancy I see him." Crossing the room, he took out a dumpy Bible, which, sure enough, bore on the fly-leaf the inscription, "To Matthew Fell, from his loving godmother, Anne Aldous, 2nd of September, 1659. It would be no bad plan to test him again, Mr. Crome. I will wager we get a couple of names in the chronicles. What have we here? Thou shalt seek me in the morning, and I shall not be. Well, well, your grandfather would have made a fine omen of that, eh? No more prophets for me, they're all in a tale. And now, Mr. Crome, I'm infinitely obliged to you for your packet. You will, I fear, be impatient to get on. Pray allow me another glass." So, with offers of hospitality, which were genuinely meant, for Sir Richard thought well of the young man's address and manner, they parted. In the afternoon came the guests, the Bishop of Kilmore, Lady Mary Hervey, Sir William Kentfield, etc. Dinner at 5, wine, cards, supper, and dispersal to bed. Next morning, Sir Richard is disinclined to take his gun with the rest. He talks with the Bishop of Kilmore. This prelate, unlike a good many of the Irish bishops of his day, had visited his see, and indeed resided there for some considerable time. This morning, as the two were walking along the terrace, and talking over the alterations and improvements in the house, the bishop said, pointing to the window of the west room, "You could never get one of my Irish flock to occupy that room, Sir Richard." "Why is that, my lord? It is in fact my own." "Well, our Irish peasantry will always have it that it brings the worst of luck to sleep near an ash tree, and you have a fine growth of ash not 2 yards from your chamber window. Perhaps," the bishop went on with a smile, "it has given you a touch of its quality already, for you do not seem, if I may say it, so much the fresher for your night's rest as your friends would like to see you." "That, or something else, it is true, cost me my sleep from 12 to 4, my lord. But the tree is to come down tomorrow, so I shall not hear much more from it." "I applaud your determination. It can hardly be wholesome to have the air you breathe strained, as it were, through all that leafage." "Your lordship is right there, I think. But I had not my window open last night. It was rather the noise that went on, no doubt from the twigs sweeping the glass, that kept me open-eyed." "I think that can hardly be, Sir Richard. Here, you can see it from this point. None of these nearest branches, even, can touch your casement unless there were a gale, and there was none of that last night. They missed the panes by a foot." "No, sir, true. What then will it be, I wonder, that scratched and rustled so? I had covered the dust on my sill with lines and marks." At last they agreed that the rats must have come up through the ivy. That was the bishop's idea, and Sir Richard jumped at it. So the day passed quietly, and night came, and the party dispersed to their rooms, and wished Sir Richard a better night. And now we are in his bedroom, with the light out, and the squire in bed. The room is over the kitchen, and the night outside still and warm, so the window stands open. There is very little light about the bedstead, but there is a strange movement there. It seems as if Sir Richard were moving his head rapidly to and fro, with only the slightest possible sound. And now you would guess, so deceptive is the half-darkness, that he had several heads, round and brownish, which move back and forward, even as low as his chest. It is a horrible illusion. Is it nothing more? There, something drops off the bed with a soft plump like a kitten, and is out of the window in a flash. Another, 4, and after that there is quiet again. "Thou shalt seek me in the morning, and I shall not be. As with Sir Matthew, so with Sir Richard, dead and black in his bed. A pale and silent party of guests and servants gathered under the window when the news was known. Italian poisoners, Popish emissaries, infected air, all these and more guesses were hazarded, and the Bishop of Kilmore looked at the tree, in the fork of whose lower boughs a white tomcat was crouching, looking down the hollow which years had gnawed in the trunk. It was watching something inside the tree with great interest. Suddenly it got up and craned over the hole. Then a bit of the edge on which it stood gave way, and it went slithering in. Everyone looked up at the noise of the fall. It is known to most of us that a cat can cry, but few of us have heard, I hope, such a yell as came out of the trunk of the great ash. 2 or 3 screams there were, the witnesses are not sure which, and then a slight and muffled noise of some commotion or struggling was all that came. But Lady Mary Hervey fainted outright, and the housekeeper stopped her ears and fled till she fell on the terrace. The Bishop of Kilmore and Sir William Kentfield stayed, yet even they were daunted, though it was only at the cry of a cat, and Sir William swallowed once or twice before he could say, "There is something more than we know of in that tree, my lord. I am for an instant search," and this was agreed upon. A ladder was brought, and one of the gardeners went up, and, looking down the hollow, could detect nothing but a few dim indications of something moving. They got a lantern, and let it down by rope. "We must get at the bottom of this. My life upon it, my lord, that the secret of these terrible deaths is there." Up went the gardener again with the lantern, and let it down the hole cautiously. They saw the yellow light upon his face as he bent over, and saw his face struck with an incredulous terror and loathing, before he cried out in a dreadful voice and fell back from the ladder, where, happily, he was caught by 2 of the men, letting the lantern fall inside the tree. He was in a dead faint, and it was some time before any word could be got from him. By then they had something else to look at. The lantern must have broken at the bottom, and the light in it caught upon dry leaves and rubbish that lay there, for in a few minutes a dense smoke began to come up, and then flame, and, to be short, the tree was in a blaze. The bystanders made a ring at some yards' distance, and Sir William and the Bishop sent men to get what weapons and tools they could, for clearly whatever might be using the tree as its lair would be forced out by the fire. So it was. First, at the fork, they saw a round body covered with fire, the size of a man's head, appear very suddenly, then seem to collapse and fall back. This 5 or 6 times. Then a similar ball leapt into the air and fell on the grass, where after a moment it lay still. The bishop went as near as he dared to it, and saw what but the remains of an enormous spider, veinous and seared. And as the fire burned lower down, more terrible bodies like this began to break out from the trunk, and it was seen that these were covered with greyish hair. All that day the ash burned, and until it fell to pieces, the men stood about it, and from time to time killed the brutes as they darted out. At last there was a long interval when none appeared, and they cautiously closed in and examined the roots of the tree. "They found," said the Bishop of Kilmore, "below it, a rounded hollow place in the earth, wherein were 2 or 3 bodies of these creatures that had plainly been smothered by the smoke, and, what is to me more curious, at the side of this den, against the wall, was crouching the anatomy or skeleton of a human being, with the skin dried upon the bones, having some remains of black hair, which was pronounced by those that examined it to be undoubtedly the body of a woman, and clearly dead for a period of 50 years. The end of The Ash Tree, from Ghost Stories of an Antiquary by M.R. James.